Okay, thanks everybody for coming out. We're going to get going here. Just going to give an introduction really quick. At the end of the table here we have Mr. Gene Ha, Zander Cannon, Ted Anderson, and John Bivens. These individuals also form the group World Monster HQ, correct? And I'm going to turn it over to them so we can learn all about the creation of comic books. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. So our studio is called World Monster HQ. We're in Northeast Minneapolis, and we've been collectively making comics for, I don't know, what's it been, 85 years, something like that, all told. And Gene Ha has been kind enough to join us. He also, I think, has done some comics. I can't remember. I think that we worked together on something. I don't know.
Maybe something Eisner Mine.
Yes, Gene has been following my coattails for ages. All joking aside, Gene Ha and I worked on Top 10 together. He also did the 49ers, which was also with Alan Moore. I did Smacks, which was also with Alan Moore. And we're here to talk about sort of creating new comics, pitching them, and the sort of through the various ways that you can do it. Like there's pitching, original work. There's also pitching projects with company-owned characters. There's coming up with new ideas. There's differentiating your work from existing works. And so I'm going to be moderating this panel, and I'm going to just ask people who have worked in mainstream comics for a long time, people who have worked in YA books, but also licensed books, people who have worked as artists on licensed books, who have worked on artists for their own creator-owned work, and how all these ways can be different. All the ways that you can pitch work and come up with new work. And so, first of all, let's talk about sort of coming up with a new idea, and not just an idea, but also how does this turn into a project that you want to work on. And so, I guess the first one is, what ideas are you kind of drawn to? John, why don't you go first? What sort of things make you go like, oh, this is a cool idea, or this is something I want to work on?
Well, I kind of focus myself or pigeonhole myself. I don't know. I don't feel like it's very limiting, but I'm very much like the horror, fantasy, sci-fi guy. So having done enough of that, making my own stuff, whenever like I want to collaborate or anything like that, people tend to see that work and they end up bringing that to me. And having put enough of that out there, people get an idea of the things I like to draw. So if you're a writer working with an artist, you want to know what the strengths of that artist they're actually going to end up being. And so essentially, if it's like cosmic horror or body horror, that kind of stuff, before working full-time in comics, I worked as a butcher, so I can draw all the gross interior stuff. So I get that kind of stuff brought to me.
Do you feel like it limits you?
I don't know if it limits me. I never get tired of it.
Okay. So draw something that you never get tired of, I think is good advice.
When I found out that you own your own set of like butcher knives, everything just kind of clicked into place for me. It's like you had that thing laid on, I'm like, oh, yes, okay, this is a Bivens thing. Oh, closer still? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm the only non-visual artist on this panel. I'm the one who's purely writer, which means on the one hand I get to work with a lot of interesting different artists and work in a lot of different visual styles. If I know that this project is going to look better with sort of a more cartoony approach, I can try and find somebody who can work with who has a cartoony style. The downside of that is, of course, I have to keep finding new artists and trying to collaborate with people. In some cases, trying to put together pitches without necessarily having anything lined up and making it more of a cold call kind of thing, where it's, we're going to put this together. If it happens, we'll work out pay structure from there. Until then, I'm just going to pay you your page rate, etc. But for what I'm interested in,
what kind of page rate do you? I mean, not to get into the weeds here, but like, do you feel like you need to sort of like have a competitive page rate for people who are doing a 4 or 5 page sample?
I mean, I tend to go off of what they suggest, and it also tends to be influenced by how recent my last paycheck was. I've found that a lot of artists I work with are willing to work at something like 150 to 200 per page. That's for fully colored, lettered, inked, everything pages. Character sketches and background sketches will sometimes go for less, like 50 to 100, again, kind of depending. And sometimes it just works out nicely where we'll kind of look at everything we want to put together for the pitch package, and it comes to roughly $6,000, and then we'll just say 6,000 and, you know, spread it out. When it comes to actually like what I want to pitch and what I want to do, I mean, that's one of the downsides to not having as coherent I don't want to say brand identity because that sort of limits it, but I mean, you very much, you have the horror, fantasy, sci-fi-ish stuff, heavy on the body horror, and I don't necessarily have as much of a focus in my work. I've done some stuff that's like mature readers, post-apocalyptic. I did one book that's cyberpunk. I did a couple YA books that are more sort of lighthearted fantasy. I've got a thing coming up now that's purely realistic YA teen relationship drama. I don't necessarily have as much of a thing where if you think of me, you're like, oh, Ted Anderson, the guy who does X. It used to be that I was Ted Anderson, the guy who wrote the My Little Pony comics, which was for a while my bread and butter, but I've spread out into doing other things, and I don't resent that work, but it's also like I'm doing other things. It was nice to have that as an identity when it was there, but yeah.
Do you think having or not having a particular brand the way that John does that limit you? Does that make you feel like, oh, it's sometimes hard to get someone's attention in any given realm?
It can. I mean, I feel like the bigger obstacle for me is simply not being able to necessarily show exactly what I'm proposing. Like I can't like put a page in front of someone necessarily and say, here's what it is. I have to find somebody else who can help me translate what I have into a visual thing. And it's sometimes a slower process, and not every editor will have the same thing in mind. So it becomes a thing of I have to sort of tailor what I'm doing to what I think editors will be interested in. So it's, I think the bigger hurdle for me is simply kind of that initial, not even the foot, not the foot in the door, because knowing editors is one thing, but here's the hook, and then here's what I imagine it can look like, is I think the slightly tougher thing for me, because I don't necessarily, I can't necessarily walk in with character designs like everyone else on the panel can.
So this is getting into something later, but I mean, do you ever come to publishers then with just a conceptual pitch or a script and say, put whoever you want on this?
Yes, and I mean that does happen, and it has to be a thing where you have to have a little more trust. You have to have a little more. You either have to be working within a formula, not a formula, but you want to be working within an idiom that already has its established ideas of here's what it's going to look like. Is this is the YA book that I mentioned, which is going to come out I think sometime next year. Fingers crossed, knock on wood. Didn't have an artist attached, but it fit relatively neatly into a form of YA that there were a lot of different artists who could do it. There were a lot of people who could work in that idiom, and we happened to find someone who I'm really happy with, but it could have been a lot of other people. It's not like it had to be drawn by this person. So it can happen. I mean, it really depends on the project. I have several projects in the works right now that really like need to have one person who has the vision, who can make it happen. And that's trickier because then I have to have that person or else it doesn't happen. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of going in three different directions here, but there's a lot of different potential for different projects that, I don't know, I find myself going in a lot of different directions.
Okay. Gene, when you are pitching something, do you come to it through a visual standpoint, I assume? Or is it more conceptual?
I mean, generally when I'm pitching a story, something like that to a publisher, I may not have visuals yet, but I'm kind of, it tends to be on concept. An important thing, well, let me ask you really quickly. How many of the people here are mainly writers but not artists? Okay. How many people here are artists, not writers? Okay. And how many people here are writers and artists? Okay.
All right.
Okay, so a combination. Because yeah, I was going to say, like, some of my experiences also is with, sometimes I have writers coming to me, pitching me on the idea of doing a story with them. And at that point, then the main thing isn't even so much the concept, it's, I know you're a writer whose work I really love, and I just want to work with you. I don't even really care what the concept is. I figure you're going to figure it out. If I'm pitching it, then it's mainly on the concept, and it's just me kind of doing an initial. I'm well known enough of a quantity where if a publisher wants to talk to me, they want to talk to me, and I can just kind of feel out, like, if I do something like this, would you be interested if I develop this pitch? And so I'm in an unusual situation.
Right, right. Well, you are somebody who can say, hello, my name is Gene Hobb, perhaps you've heard of me.
And then after
I would like to do this comic.
And then when I flesh it out, then they can shoot me down.
Right. Or now that leads to something. How much do you stick to your guns if an editor has a notes on something? And one way, if it's company-owned characters one way if it's your own characters?
I generally don't. I don't have a huge desire to work on stories, to write stories with somebody else's product, because I feel like it's such a waste of energy, and it tends to have so many layers of approval processes, where they're just shoot things down for the craziest reason of just like, oh no, our character can't wear that. That's not part of his iconic costume or, ethos. And then 3 issues later, he's wearing that, and it's kind of like, you lied to me, or you didn't know what's going on. But anyway, if I'm doing my own thing, then the important thing is I have to know what's the important essence of the story, and what can be stripped out or what can be replaced, and it doesn't really matter. But if they start intruding on that essential nut of the story and destroy it, there's no point.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, just piggybacking on that. I mean, one of my most recent books I had that was originally going to be like a 6-issue mini. I pitched it as like a 6-issue miniseries. Then it became like a 5-issue miniseries, and then it became a graphic novel about the length of like a 4-issue miniseries. I just kind of had to keep cutting off sort of edges of it and making sure that the core stayed intact, and having to just be like, well, does this scene, do I need this scene? I guess not. This scene? And I'm still proud of that work. It could have been twice as long, but like just remembering, okay, here's what it is, and it needs to remain this, to help me kind of get through that process of being like, okay, we carve out this, and this. Whatever that core element is, just sticking to it.
Yeah, I find that, well, personally, I find that if it's company-owned characters, I'm like, okay, whatever you like, I can figure it out, because I'm having to figure it out based on their situation anyway. And I feel like I stick to my guns way more when it's my own thing. And like you said, if they start intruding on the core idea.
Yeah, I mean, I've also done like educational books or nonfiction books about like the Boston Tea Party, and I'm not exactly going to like go out of my way to bust heads on like, no, they absolutely have to be, doing it. It's like, it's a historical event. I'm going to be going by the resources, obviously. I'm not going to be, pushing for radical script changes at the last minute.
John, do you ever run into people who are saying like, this style of art is extremely gross. I need you to dial it back.
I've talked with like some publisher friends and stuff like that who are like, your art's really good. We don't have a project for you right now because
blech.
Yeah, because we don't have anything like that goes this extreme or anything like that. And personally, I don't think my stuff goes that extreme, but I can understand it. But when they get something like a license for like Clive Barker books or something like that, then at that point they're like, so what are you doing now? And you get that kind of work. On the other side of it, I was very fortunate. Like the first long, or maybe not fortunate, the first long form book I did was with Image, and it was Dark Engine. And essentially, like, you don't have an editor unless you bring one in. And it literally, if we shot off an email to Eric Stevenson asking, so is it okay for us to do this with the story? He's like, I'm busy. I don't care about this. Just do whatever you're going to do.
Sometimes that's the greatest editor to have of all.
And then every once in a while you need someone to say, well, maybe you might want to dial it back a little.
Well, John, while you have that microphone, what's your opinion of things like log lines, like, oh, it's X meets Y, it's Blade Runner meets heavy metal or whatever?
I think it makes for a really easy way to have an elevator pitch, right? And everyone needs to have an elevator pitch. Actually, if I'm typing up my own like proposals, usually there is at the top the elevator pitch, and then underneath that's going to be the extended pitch, right? Because hopefully you grab them with that elevator, and then they want to keep on reading. Then you have that, then you have your character descriptions, and then essentially everything else is like, you're going to have like your pages of artwork, you'll have script for like the first issue, and then like concept art and that kind of stuff. So, which this is actually a pitch that I finished up this year with like Justin Jordan, who I worked on Spread with from Image.
So is that essentially the pitch itself, just bound into a mini comic?
Without the plot breakdown, because I didn't want to give away like the entire story, right? So that's essentially like a pitch, 7 pages of artwork, and then the script for that, and then like some concept sketches for some of the creatures in it.
So that's pretty interesting to make it into a product. do you feel like that's helpful to do it before the comic has come out, or is it just?
Well, my feeling is that if I'm going to draw something, I'm going to monetize it in some way. Yeah, right. I put together an ash can. There's always going to be people that want to get into the industry, so they're at least going to want to know what a script looks like, a professional script, and they're going to want to know, like, okay, so what are you putting together for pages that you're going to be showing an editor or a publisher, that kind of stuff. So, essentially, if I make a pitch, I'm at least going to make money off of the mini comic.
So how much, Ted? How much world building or lore do you do when you're still in the process of pitching something? Too much or not enough?
Almost certainly too much. I mean, enough to make sure the story stands up. I mean, talking earlier about like having a core concept and like whatever it boils down to, what's the core conceit of it all? I mean, so the project I referred to earlier that like kept getting bits shaved off. It's a book called Side Effects, where the premise was it's a girl in her first year of college, going through extreme emotional stress. She has depression, anxiety. She starts getting therapy and then starts taking various medications, which she keeps having to switch because she keeps getting various side effects. And sort of the gimmick of it is that the various medications she takes also give her superpowers. Like each medication also gives her a superpower in addition to some like debilitating side effect. Like she can shoot electricity out of her fingers, and she also gets horrible headaches. Or she can, what was the one she had? She can read people's minds, but then she also like has insomnia and falls asleep at the wrong time. And that's like, that is the core concept right there, is the idea of, okay, you're dealing with, trying to sort out your own mental issues. You have both these advantages and disadvantages on these various medications. You're trying to get well, and what does wellness look like? It did not matter to me at all, like, why this is happening. I went into zero of the things behind, like, is it something about the pills? Is there like a sinister pharmaceutical company? That does not matter in the slightest. It does not come up in the book. There's nothing to it, because that book, the emotional core of it is the emotional and like the metaphorical truth at the heart of it is what's important. But then I do have books that have a big like sort of mythological element to it, that like another pitch that I'm working on has sort of a cryptid Hellboy-esque vibe to it, and I wanted to figure out, okay, what's causing all the creepy, horrible stuff in this town, and I did. And there's elements of like, okay, well here's some of the history of it, here's why it did this, why it did that, and I don't have to plot out every single detail, but I want to know enough that if someone asks me like, well, okay, so how did this start, or like what happened with this period, I can answer them vaguely like, oh yeah, that'd be cool if there was an element where this, I'm being very vague here, I know, but like maybe the town did this thing at this time because of the weird mythology. Having enough to just be able to answer whatever questions come up is what's necessary. And like, you can build 12,000 years of backstory history for your gigantic mega project, but like your time is probably better spent in just making sure of like figuring out what the reader is going to see on page one.
And don't you feel like that kind of locks you into something that you might be a little bit defensive about if they want changes?
Oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, you do have to accept that. Like, yeah, not every editor is going to. A lot of editors are going to say, like, okay, how much of this do we actually need? What if you did this? What if you did that? What's going to result in the best experience on the page? Because you're looking at it from the inside out, and every reader is coming at it from the outside in, and you just have to make a compromise or not a compromise, but just realize here's what their experience is going to be like. They don't necessarily need to see the structural cross-section of the building for every project.
Gene, do you ever think of, when you're pitching a comic book, do you ever think, oh, this could be a TV show, or this could be a video game, or this could be a,
Oh, sorry, just saw some friends back there. It does not hurt to have that there. I'm going to say, okay, so the secret of superpower of American comic books is that we have, our domestic movie industry is Hollywood, and they are happy to take a comic book instead of a script, which is just dense 90 pages of text, and browse it and say, oh, this could be a movie, instead of, oh, you have to read the whole thing to see if it's going to be a movie. So that's what powers American comic books over, say, French comic books or Japanese comic books. And therefore, American publishers know if it's easy to license, it's easier to make a profit on it, even if we only sell 2,000 copies and lose $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 printing it. But if we get the license money, then it makes sense. So
Yeah.
that does help.
And even if that movie doesn't do particularly well, it's on a totally different scale than comic books. Like, that's a great advertising.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Failed movies are great advertising for great comic books.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the movie Whiteout by Greg Rucka and Steve Lieber, that movie didn't do anything, but I think that the license, or, but the option and the license bought Steve Lieber a house.
Yeah. Oh, wait. Well, I got the mic. I just want to throw something a little bit off topic of this immediate thing and just mention something, an old piece of wisdom I got about pitching corporate IP, which I'd heard early in my career, which then somebody informed me is no longer true. So early in my career, I was told, if you want to do something for like DC or Marvel, DC gets 1 million pitches for Batman stories, but they don't get so many pitches for Ragman stories. And if you can figure out a way to make a cool Ragman story and make Ragman valuable IP, that's the thing an editor's really interested in. And I heard this as common wisdom for like 2 decades. I've been in the industry for 3 decades. And then the last pitching panel, story panel I was on, I was with Katie Kubert, and I mentioned this. She said, "That's not really true anymore."
Because nobody wants to buy a Ragman comic,
Right.
except for Phil Hester.
I'm interested in your Batman pitches.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing where it's like, oh yeah, like a good Batman comic can subsidize the entire line of DC for 2 years.
Well, and also, I mean, regardless of whether or not it gets picked up to make a show out of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the character's stature is going to be raised any higher, and those shows might turn out to be an enormous waste of money. I mean, we've been having various Swamp Thing media projects for how many years now, and like, the comic is still by far the best thing that has ever happened to Swamp Thing, and those TV shows and movies have kind of been less than substantial, so...
How dare you speak that way about Return of Swamp Thing, but starring Heather Locklear.
Do not bring your
Great
live
movie.
here.
The original, it's Adrian. Come on. Oh, man.
So when you pitch something, how much would you leave for, like if you're starting to come up with an idea, how much do you leave for a collaborator to fill in? Do you sort of like, do you kind of do everything and then say, oh, I'll get a writer to kind of like pretty this up? Or do you say, these are the concepts, these are the characters, this is the world, but I'm going to need somebody to come up with sort of like issue by issue plots?
I think that because generally if I'm going to go ahead and plot something out myself, I'm just going to go ahead and write it. But if I'm going to actually plot as a team, like I have a book over at the table called Cult Classic Creature Feature. The main reason that I even ended up making that book was because Elliot was local with me, and I was like, you know what, it's going to be great to be able to actually just go to a bar, sit across the table, and like spitball what we want to have plotted out for us. And then we break apart, he writes the script, gives it to me, and I go ahead and take his script and do whatever I do with it, right? So that was, I mean, in that type of collaboration, that's the closest I ever got to that. And I think the only reason I did it was because I wanted to have that fun of like world building, spitballing together. So I think that's the only way that could actually happen for me, because that is not attractive to me, like trying to do that by email or anything like that. I actually want to see the person. I want us to be able to like plot something out in like an afternoon and then break apart.
It's nice to see their face when you come up with an idea rather than having them go, oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's like, that joke landed, or that joke was horrible, we're never using that. Yeah, exactly.
And of course, if you're meeting in person, you also get sometimes their half-baked ideas where the other person will be like, well, what if we did this? Oh, no, that's not great. And you can say, well, what? It's like, well, what if we could do this? And I'm like, oh, that's great. We could do it like this. And having having that collaboration on like the minute-to-minute level can be really valuable for a project. So my experience has been, largely so far, it's been me telling the artist what to draw and the artist having not as much free reign as I really could have been giving them. There's been some projects where later on I'm talking with the artist, I'm like, oh man, if only we could have done this together. Like, you could have shared some ideas on this, and you could have told me how this, like, shared some ideas there. And I've tried to be more open to that. It hasn't always worked just because of the structure of what I've been pitching. Like, again, the book that's going to be coming out next year, I kind of had to go into that with a full plot and everything, and so the artist didn't really have a chance to give me any of their thoughts on, oh, what is this character does that? What this character does that? Which that's sort of the nature of that specific beast. But then there are other projects I'm working on right now where I do get to speak with the artist to be like, hey, here's the bare bones. What would you want to do more of? What do you really want to draw? What are the things that you think would be cool to have visually? How do we lay that out? It's enormously valuable, but it's tricky to make that happen. And it has to kind of happen early on in the process before any contracts have been signed or anything has been sort of put into stone, I suppose.
So the last time I did a really serious pitch, we did a lot of preview art, but it was with a well-known writer who's done novels and comics. And then they were living in California. I'm living outside Chicago. And we didn't get to meet in person during the whole time we were developing the pitch. And they kept on sending me art from video games, of video game character concepts, of what they wanted the character to look like. But which I took, oh, you're sending me this specific style of illustration, of highly rendered digital illustrations. You want a detailed style for this story. Which I didn't realize was the point. They only wanted the costumes, that style of costume. So I was doing these overly detailed, draw every shoelace type of drawing, which is taking me forever. And it took me months to realize, oh, I could have done this all simpler. You didn't need the shoelaces.
Oh, God. You were doing the shoelaces.
Yeah, and we weren't meeting in person, so that's the thing. The ideal thing is if we're sitting at a restaurant together and they say something, I can immediately whip out a piece of paper and just doodle something. Is this what you want? And then doodle again, say, is this what you want? And then just, that kind of process is great instead of do an email, a week later to respond to the email, give you some notes, and then I miss the essential point of, and keep it simple.
Do you feel like Zoom and all those other sort of like networking things with it where you can share your screen? Do you think that kind of helps?
It helps a bit, but I mean, not as much. It's so hard to just like put a drawing in front of somebody on Zoom and have them really see everything, and just in person for me, as far as that stage of stuff, is really invaluable, especially when you're doing stuff that's outside your normal range. If they're saying do exactly what you've done before, that's easy. I've done it before. I know what he looks like. But if they're trying to push me outside of what I normally have done before, then it's hard to figure out what they want me to do that I haven't done before.
How often do you just kind of say, I am going to draw this how I've drawn it before, and you don't have a choice?
I mean, my way of thinking about story is that I always try to adapt the art to the story, and to make any adaptation necessary for the story, to tell the story the best way possible, which means sometimes pushing outside my established style. So if I feel like the story needs it, I'll just do it. I'm kind of crazy that way, so yeah.
So Gene and John, when you have something, do you ever sort of feel like, oh, I'd really just rather jump into this? Do you ever like just getting a finished script and just going, whatever, I'm just gonna draw it now? Does that help, or does that sort of make you feel like, I don't know if I want to do this?
It's always it feels like a risk when I get a partial script or like only 2 pages of script and have to start off because I don't know where it's going. I don't know what's going to develop. If I get the full script, I'm working on a story now with Gail Simone. It's already been announced for Pat and Oswald's Minor Threads for the character Crab Louie. The fact that I got the full script means I'm able to tie together panels from the second page with panels from the last page, and it's the same image, but ... And then I keep on doing that back and forth throughout the whole issue, so the whole thing structurally and emotionally, like the structure, the symbolism, everything fits together and reinforces itself throughout the whole story. And things pay off later, and I know where they're going to pay off later. And if I just get bit by bit, it's just like I'm pulling out of my ass every panel.
Which is kind of how Alan Moore used to send scripts too.
He was a genius.
Yeah.
So he was making all kinds of different company knowing how he was going to do it, so it was okay.
Yeah, definitely rather have the full script because I've also been in that situation where, and I don't know how this happens unless they're like Alan Moore and writing like a 2-page for every page script or something like that. But I've been in the situation where I've been drawing and essentially I'm like racing the writer, right? And so I'll get to a point and then it's like, okay, I'm waiting for the page. All right, I have no idea why it's taking longer for you to type a page than it is for me to draw a page. So I'd much rather have the full script. And then the exact same thing, like if I wanted to put little Easter eggs in like the beginning that can actually go into the end of the script, then I can go ahead and do that. So.
How about Marvel style? Have you ever worked so-called Marvel style? That's where the writer would write a description, a plot that would sort of, maybe describe a page in 2 or 3 sentences, and then leave it to the artist to do the sort of panel by panel storytelling, and then the writer comes back later to dialogue it. Have you worked that way, John?
Strangely, I told people that I'd be fine with it if they did it, but I always seem to get like a full script, even when it's like really quick anthology pieces that were like not being paid for, or something like that, something that you're doing for a benefit. I'm like, we're doing this for a benefit. You don't have to write the full script. Just go ahead and give me like an idea, and then I'll show you the panel layout and thumbnail, and you can dialogue it from that or something like that. I don't know, something about today. People just give full scripts. I guess they're not trying to run an entire like Marvel line of comics by themselves or anything like that.
And even Marvel does it. No. They demand full scripts. Ted, have you ever worked Marvel style?
No, but I've always been curious about trying it. And for some projects, I mean, it depends a lot on how well I know the collaborator and what their strengths are. I would like to do that more with certain artists, where it's like, this scene is a fight scene, or this scene is a characters are sort of marveling at the beauty of nature, or whatever, and be able to let them tell that, because I don't always have the same visual intuition that an artist does. Like, I don't necessarily think to myself, what's the best way to lay out this page for reasons X, Y, and Z. When it comes to dialogue, I'm pretty picky. Like, I tend to write dialogue first, and I break up the dialogue by panel breaks, because for me, it makes, when I read a comic and like the dialogue has to fit the rhythm of the page in a way that I'm very particular about. So like that, I'll do a thing where like, okay, panel 1, 2 characters speak. Panel 2, 2 characters speak. Panel 3, 3 characters speak. And then I'll have to go back and later on like write panel descriptions. And sometimes I have to just be like, I don't know, they're still talking. And in those cases, it's helpful to have a collaborator and be like, well, okay, I could do a close-up of this character's hands as they're cooking something or whatever. Like, oh, that's great. So it's something I'm getting more open to and feeling more comfortable with, and being like, okay, I don't necessarily have to say in every single panel what the visual is, because you're going to be able to see it. You're going to see, oh yeah, it makes more sense if we have these kind of this angle or this particular action being depicted or something like that. So
Bill Willingham on Fables used to do a combination of that. He would do panel descriptions and dialogue in sort of dialogue panels and sort of ordinary panels, and then he would say 3-page fight scene.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. I mean, and the fight scene is typically the most, not just the most visually impressive, but also the most like, it's so reliant on the rhythm and the specific layouts, and like being able to see where the tangents are. Oh, this character is holding a knife in this panel, and that can be used to lead the eye to the next panel. Like it comes down to such. It comes down to the visual element so much that you can't account for it in the script unless there's something really specific that needs to happen. And even then, you just have to be like, okay, so they're fighting. One character accidentally, lets a knife swing through, and they drop their weapon, and then the other guy grabs it, whatever. Like, even then, you just give the broadest possible beats, because the artist is going to be more up close to the action, I guess, the best way to put it.
Talking about pitches, and how much do you say in a pitch about like, okay, how much do you lay out, moment by moment, issue by issue, and how much do you kind of say, it's a mystery story that involves these elements, and here's the twist?
I mean, as long as the publisher trusts this, I don't pitch usually as an artist or as a writer. So as far as I understand it, for the writer and the publisher, as long as they trust the writer and know that they know how to write, they're not worried about the details you're going to fill in later, because they know you're a skilled writer. They just want to know what's cool about this, and essentially it's like a menu description of a dish you're going to order. You don't want to. It's not supposed to be a recipe. It's not supposed to have all the ingredients and the whole process. It's just, why is this cool? Why is this fun? Why is this going to be delicious? And if you have to describe a few plot elements or twists to get across that point, that's great. But you're probably doing something wrong if you're trying to explain the whole plot and it's getting over a page long. So,
well, oh, sorry. Just one more for Gene. When you pitched May, your fantasy series, you originally pitched it to Dark Horse, right?
I kind of pitched it around a little bit, but Dark Horse is where an editor really, really liked what I was doing and was really interested to see what I was going to do with it.
And how much of the story did you sort of pitch, or did you sort of say like it's going to have this basic structure and this basic sort of like style of story?
I'm going to say at that point, by the time they kind of pitched to them, I knew I was doing it as a Kickstarter, so I had a lot of samples at that point of finished art, and actually almost the whole story just kind of laid out in pencils by that point at least, I think, maybe even inks.
Okay.
So
The whole first issue with the Herb?
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, there was a lot of story, like 2 issues worth or something like that, of story kind of laid out. So that wasn't hard. Let's see.
So that's an interesting twist, is that like, you know, there's Kickstarter now, so you don't always have to go and sort of prove yourself to a publisher.
Yeah.
You can kind of give the pitch to your potential readers and cut out the middleman.
Yeah, I'm going to say, like, in general, this is both for getting a job with a comic book company, like on a regular gig, like writing Spider-Man, or for pitching a book. Essentially, the ideal situation for a publisher is you don't need them, and you have kind of a product that you don't need the publisher for, but they can jump in and just get a little bit of the money stream. So if you, it's like if you're a successful webcomic artist, that's kind of the ideal situation, or successful Hollywood screenwriter. That's kind of an ideal situation for a publisher to step in and say, oh, we know you know how to do this stuff already, therefore we'll hire you. If you're somebody who's not published, not a screenwriter, doesn't have a lot of credits yet, that's really hard because they don't know if they can trust you yet. Or if you have two whole comic books, that's easy.
It's possible that if you're in that situation, you almost have to have something completely finished, like your first issue. No, I mean, not that that was the situation for you, but your first issue was completely finished, and people could go, oh yeah, okay, we'll publish that.
Every American artist. Every American artist's dream is to be able to have some larger publisher come in and just acquire you, and then everything else happens for you. I'm being sarcastic with that because we're large publishers, but like it helps if you could just say, here's the first chapter, or here's the first X pages of it, or here's what it already is. But yeah, that's not always the case. I mean, in my case, I'm typically pitching something cold. I don't have anything else. I don't have anything already to show them from this project. So in my case, with how the pitch looks, I mean, I'm working with a book agent. I'm working primarily with book publishers, not comics publishers, which there is a big distinction. And like, it's not a super strict format, but there is something of a format to how you lay out your pitch. I mean, you have your title, author, and then typically some sort of. I don't put the log line first. I do like the back of the book summary first. You know, so and so is a investigator who was thrown out after a botched raid, but now they're coming back because of the business. Will they be able to stop the villain in time?
Do you find that having to do it in that format kind of solidifies some ideas in your head?
It definitely does, because it's like, oh yeah, for me, that establishes the vibe, because the vibe is very much like, it's not necessarily what I start with, but I have to have that nailed down before I can go any further. It's like, what is the vibe of this? What is the feeling? What is the sort of moment to moment emotion of it intended to be? And that first very brief summary is intended to set the vibe. Then they sometimes give a log line. It's, you know, X beats Y. It's this for this audience. Description of page count, numbers, and so forth, comps if possible. Then I'll maybe do characters and a much more detailed plot summary after that. But like, that first setup is, you have a limited amount of time to catch the publisher's attention, or anybody's attention, and you have to kind of take that chance and run with it and say, here's what you are going to get out of this.
Do you ever kind of?
I just want to add in, when I say you don't have to do a blow-by-blow summary of the whole plot and stuff like that, if you are pitching a series, what you just said, explaining what each issue is going to cover and how it's going to progress and why the issues are going to be addictive. Yeah, but you don't have to describe the whole plot. You have to explain this. This is a series, and I know how to turn this into a series.
Yeah, you have to demonstrate, you know, what book 2 is going to be, and like based off of book 1. You know.
I mean, do you ever sort of find yourself in the position where you're like, oh, I've pitched a story that's basically like an intergalactic war against an evil empire, and realize, oh, I have to differentiate this from, you know, the one that everybody knows about?
Yeah, I mean, that is always the question, is like, what distinguishes this from books X, Y, and Z? What is the, you know, unique sellable asset you are bringing to it? What are the, you know, the 3 other tropes that you're bringing in to sort of differentiate this? That is crucial. It's like, it's not just it's not just a YA mystery. It's a YA mystery where the main character is disabled or something. Sorry, this is making it sound like I'm downplaying or minimizing the aspect of character identification. it's more than that, but it is something where you do have to establish what is it about this book that's making it a unique read and not simply Hunger Games 2.0. Because that was the trend in YA for a while, wasn't it? Was just making the Hunger
Yeah,
Games
it seems
over.
like for a while Hunger Games 2.0 was like a guaranteed sale.
Yeah, so in my day job, I'm a librarian at a middle school, and like some of the schools in our district literally have an entire like dystopian section that essentially exists because of the Hunger Games. And that's not even a knock on the Hunger Games. I like the Hunger Games. I think it's a fantastic series, but it sure spawned a lot of knockoffs and similar works. So anyway, I'm sorry.
Better that than a bunch of wizard schools, I guess.
Yeah, can you imagine what kind of world we'll be living in with that?
So now, what led you to getting an agent? Back to you, Ted.
I mean,
I'll have something for you in a minute, Todd.
initially, the agent found me. I was lucky enough to have, and this is another example of what happens with pitches. So I was working with an artist on a very specific pitch, and this is an artist who had a decent enough social media following that when she started posting pages, we got a mild amount of attention. We got a brief write-up on like IO9, because I think this is when IO9 was still a going concern. And that got enough attention for an agent to contact us out of the blue, and that started the process there. And that project never really materialized for a couple different reasons. Like 2 different publishers acquired it and then shut down, which cursed. But that was the starting point of that. But it really was a question of, again, this is the separation between like the book world and the comics world, the book publishing world, comics world. In the book publishing world, you really have to have a formal arrangement. You have to know the editors. You have to have an agent who will send it to the right people with the right phrasing, do it at the right time, in the right places. With comics, it can be much looser. It's much more of a handshake arrangement. It can be, going up to an editor at the bar after San Diego or whatever and being able to talk with them, or just like a handshake arrangement at their table when you're chatting or whatever.
And sometimes that handshake arrangement can fall apart entirely.
Oh, of course, and result in a lot of people suing each other or things like that. There are advantages and disadvantages to both those structures, but you need to have the agent if you're trying to publish things in the book world, because it has its codes, it has its way of doing things, and it's simply not feasible to be an independent writer going it alone when you're pitching to book publishers. And then of course there's the catch-22 of like you need to have some work to interest an agent so you can get some work. So that's it's capitalism is grand, isn't it?
So, Gene, you have the same agent as Ted, from what I gather.
Daryl Hyde? Yeah.
So, how I know that you pitch things in comics, but also in YA. So, when do you use your agent and when do you not?
The funny thing that happened is that, so like the story I mentioned before, it turned out it was for a post-apocalyptic YA graphic novel. And by the time we actually got the pitch out there, we were informed that for the last year, YA post-apocalyptic graphic novels had fallen out of fashion. It didn't matter what an agent attached to it or how good the pitch was, nobody wanted it. We did use my agent for that pitch a little bit, but it turned out, the writer is much better known than me in the broader world of publishing and Hollywood. So her agent is much more high profile with like international famous novelist, bestseller clients and stuff like that. And she wasn't able to get traction with it. But it was insane how high powered that agent was.
So then if you're pitching something to DC, not necessarily DC Comics, but Image Comics or Dark Horse Comics, would you use your sort of literary agent for that, or would you just kind of go straight to them?
Because oftentimes when I meet editors from DC or Marvel or comic shop publishers, it'll be because I travel to a lot of comic conventions around the nation, sometimes around the world. I'll meet the editors at New York, Baltimore, San Diego, stuff like that, and you will just be hanging out. My agent usually isn't there. So in that situation, I'm just throwing stuff, but I don't pitch that often. And usually I'm just hanging out, having drinks or dinner or something like that with a circle of friends. So, just come up. They'll ask me what I'm doing.
Does the pitching process ever work the other way around, where the agent will say, hey, we're looking for, one thing, now that post-apocalyptic YA stuff is out of fashion, all of a sudden, cats doing funny things is in fashion, so let's see what you got.
Well, okay, I'm going to throw out there's a whole process also you mentioned of finding an artist. So part of in a sense, a part of the pitching process is pitching to an artist. If for my weakness is if you're a writer I really love, and I have a gap in my schedule I can put the project in, I will probably say yes. So that's what happened with Gail Simone. That happened with the unannounced project happening after that, where it's kind of like, hey, Gene, let me pitch this at you. You know we're friends and I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm just going to say yes. Okay, but let me pitch it at you. Other artists will need different things. So like, let's say if you're a relatively unknown writer and you're trying to get an artist on board, you can offer a few things. Like obviously you can offer a page rate. And if you're not offering partial ownership of the project, it better be a decent page rate, or at least something they can use that'll make incredible samples. If you can offer an ownership share in the project, that also implies you're offering some creative leverage over how the project develops, where it goes, who the character's going to be, twists in the plot and genre and stuff like that. So you need to offer some ownership. People who have like full scripts, I need this drawn, and also you're going to be lucky to work with me because Hollywood's going to love this thing even though we're both unknown. That's not going to fly. One last thing I should mention also is if you're both relatively unknown and you don't have a giant page rate to give to the person, another thing you can offer is essentially, you can say, I'd like to do something like, as a writer, you can say, I'd like to do something like this. And you as an artist, what is it you want to do? Because you probably wouldn't phrase it this way, but you're probably not that good at dialogue. You're probably not good at tight plotting and making the story arcs, character arcs, and all that really satisfying for a reader over the course of a long story. And I'm the person who can make all that work for you. But if you tell me what you want to do, and it's aligns with the stuff I want to do, and we both have an equal share in the ownership, I can make it work, the story work, and you can make the art work, and we both win.
And Ted, when you pay someone to do sort of sample pages, you still give them 50-50 ownership, right, or something like that?
I think so. It really hasn't come up of just the samples or of the full book.
Of the full book.
Of the full book, I believe it's. Good question. I'm actually not sure. I think this.
But that's kind of the arrangement where it's like, the artist will get a little bit of extra money at the front, like a page rate, but it would be 50-50 ownership.
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, the books that I've done have all been the artist has had at least, if not equal ownership, at least close to equal. I'm trying to remember exactly how some of them have lined up. It's been a while since I've had to dig through the contracts. Good question. But yeah, and then what Gene was saying, I mean, I've had that exact situation where it's like I've been talking with someone I know about working on a book, and I'm like, well, okay, what do you want to draw? And they're like, I want to draw this, this, and this. Like, okay, we can make a structure on this, do that. Yeah, no, that's very valuable to say, I know what you want to work on, or I know what you want to draw. Here's how we can make that something palatable to a publisher and an editor and ultimately an audience.
John, when you get that, when somebody gives you that kind of pitch, is that ideal where you say like, yeah, I've got a bunch of things that I want to draw, mostly guts and blood, and limbs being chopped off?
The kind of pitch where, what do you want to do?
Yeah,
kind of thing?
where your sort of visual style and your sort of like obsessions will guide it a little bit.
Well, let's go back to when I was talking about cult classic creature feature and that kind of stuff with Elliot. I literally gave him a list of movies that he had to watch for doing this, and he still hasn't forgiven me for Terror Vision. But essentially the kind of movies that were going to be like the love letter that I wanted to do to 80s film within this series. And so we got the book done, so I guess it worked out. Yeah.
So, John, when you're sort of starting on a project, do you ever sort of consider the workload in terms of like the concept? Do you ever sort of say like, oh wait, this is going to be set in like a giant city of like 1 million windows, and they're all made out of like H.R. Giger stuff, like, and go like, oh man, that's going to take me 200 years to draw?
No, because you figure out relatively quick how to find out tricks, shorthand it, and I still get scripts with horses and that kind of stuff all the time. So
horses, yes, horse skeletons maybe, spiral staircases.
Yeah, horse. All sorts of horses, all sorts of cars. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. We're running out of time. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any Yeah.
I was just wondering out of this.
I was wondering if any of you have gotten any, like, not pressure, but like encouragement or suggestions to try to use generative AI as part of your pitches, and how you respond, how you feel about that. I've seen artists talking about that in social media, so just curious if you run across that at all.
I think from a, I'll start. I just think from a wanting to work with anybody ever again type of scenario, that's a bad idea, because if you talk to artists and basically say like, oh, I've decided to cut you out of the equation, it's not a great look. Anyway, John.
Yeah, from the like, three of us here are both writer artists, so there's no reason for any three of us to use generative AI. And then there's the other downsides, like multiple conventions have basically said if there's AI on the table, you can't show. So, yeah.
Yeah, I personally have zero interest in ever using it. I can see the case for it being useful for really early, like, concept, concept design. So saying like, oh, give me a spooky church in the woods kind of thing, and then giving that to the artist, saying, okay, let's kind of work from this, not tracing, but like, here's the vibe, maybe try some of this. But like anything more sophisticated than that, it's just, no, there is absolutely no reason to use it. There's no, it's only going to regurgitate what it's already seen, and it's not going to be able to give you anything truly interesting or innovative.
I heard a story from somebody who's Hollywood adjacent, so he works a lot with Hollywood, he works with a lot of screenwriters, that the reason that the writer's strike went so long and then ended so suddenly was that everyone who's a real story writer knows AI will not be able to do a full story. It can write a scene, but it can't write a story where the scenes all fit together to build to a bigger climax and payoff. But people who don't understand story, like Hollywood producers, didn't realize this. So when the strike started, they thought, oh, everyone inside of the tech world is telling us AI is going to be able to write scripts in the next few weeks. Well, as soon as that happens, we'll just fire all the writers, so we don't care about this strike. And as the months went by, and they kept on asking the tech guys who were running the AI, when are you going to hand us a script? And the scripts came in, and they were horrible. They were like, but you're going to fix this in a few weeks, right? Oh yeah, 2 more weeks. You're going to have a finished script that's beautiful. And after a few months, they realized, oh, it's never going to happen. And then the strike ended.
It's not as good. It's not good enough to take your job, but it's good enough to convince your boss that it can take your job. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it is just the ethics of it. And if you want to work with an artist, or if an artist wants to work with a writer, that it's like any attempt to cut them out of the equation is going to be met with resistance.
Here's why I don't need you. Yeah, that's great selling point.
Another question.
I'm not a writer or an artist, so it's fascinating to learn all this behind the scenes. But one of the things, as I get a little bit older, I have trouble kind of losing myself in comics, which is my favorite thing, right? Just to kind of have this immersive experience. And I imagine that's really difficult for you guys since you know so much about what goes into them. But I'm looking for like a recommendation or something you found that you were able to find, kind of lose yourself, and just that you really enjoyed and were surprised.
So we're talking about recommendations, good comics.
Well, I came into comics originally I was a 90s kid. It was all about the artists and that kind of stuff that I followed. So, and that lizard part of my brain still exists there. So, like James Herron and Ultra Mega, like I can look at that stuff all day.
It's a really good question. I mean, I'm trying to think of anything I've read recently that really like tickled the right parts of my brain and made me kind of forget about looking at it on a craft level.
Well, I have one. There's a book from IDW recently called Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, about a serial killer who lives in basically like Richard Scarry's Busy Town, and they go out of town and sensibly murder people in a different town, but then someone murders someone in their town and they have to find out who it is to deflect suspicion away from them. It's pretty grotesque, and it is a great comic.
I guess the thing I've read most recently that I didn't even get a chance to finish, but like I had it from the library, and it was extremely overdue. But like the one that I really enjoyed was there's a book called Mary Tyler Moorhawk by, I'm completely forgetting the guy's name. I absolutely can't remember it. And it's this weird metafictional thing of like there's this fictional character named Mary Tyler Moorhawk, and a TV show made about her, and then there's also reviews of this show made by this person with the exact same name as the creator, who's not the creator, who's a separate person. It's like it's not quite House of Leaves, but it's this multimedia project that's really fascinating, and I wish I'd had time to actually finish the thing, but it was really good, and I remember wanting to dig deeper into it.
Okay, I'm going to make 2 recommendations. The first is if you like dramas like NYPD Blue, The Wire, or Zander Cannon's and Gene Ha's Top 10. Can I borrow that for a second? Seriously, Alan Moore is a fan of this book. This book is really incredibly good. It's a solo project from one of the people on the panel. I won't name who, but he's the host. The other recommendation is for everybody here interested in pitching or finding artists or anything like that. There's a comics instructor and also famous comics writer named Jim Zub in Canada. He teaches at art school there, and he's done a series of 101s on how to pitch books, find artists, and all that type of stuff on his thing. His last name is spelled Z-U-B. And they're incredibly good guys on all these basic 101 things and how to break into the comic book industry in various ways. They're on his blog, but if you just Google Zub 101 comics, you'll find it.
Okay, last question. We just have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. Question up.
All right, so you're all established in the industry, and I know you all have your own stories of how you got into there, back to like hooking and pitching and even like shaking hands at a bar. Now in this time, has any of that changed? What's maybe some advice about how to shake a hand, or someone doesn't know who you are? What's the line between being a creepy stalker versus, hey, just walking up to someone? What do you say? Why should they spend 2 minutes talking to you? Something like that.
I'd say, well, the main thing that's still consistent is I still believe that conventions are very important. If you produce even like mini comics for yourself for a while and you start doing conventions, after 3 years pass, essentially you're going to know everyone else that's in that artist alley, and the publishers are going to recognize you and all that kind of stuff. It's going to take time, but essentially, like, you can pitch as much as you want. It really helps like them knowing your face when you do it.
Yeah, I have the same question. If anyone knows how to do this. No, I'm being facetious here, but it is, I mean, the piece of advice that I've heard that really resonated with me recently was just hearing the idea of, when you first enter the industry, and this is true of any industry really, but when you're first trying to get into it, don't sort of find the people who are the big names and try to suck up to them and be their friends, and don't try to, approach them cold as though they, they're your only lifeline. Look for your peers. Look for the people around you who are sort of at the same stage, and try to, connect with them and see what they're doing and how they're working and what successes they're having, and find a network of people sort of at your level, as it were, who can sort of, you can be part of that community that's going to be up and coming in the next one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think having something to show for it, especially especially when someone is young and they say, oh, this is my comic and it's part 1 of 500 and it's going to be this it's amazing epic, and it's like, well, but one, people are like, I don't know if I want to get involved in all that. 2, they're like, they can't tell if you can sort of stick the landing on a story, and 3, it's like when you are on chapter 45 of this, you're still going to be kind of stuck with chapter 1, which is going to look like garbage, because as you get better, your original stuff looks terrible. And so I always feel like, write an 8-page story, write a 12-page story, write a 6-page story. I mean, when you can show that you can stick the landing on those, that puts you head and shoulders above all the other people who are like, I got a 500-page story that I've only gotten 12 pages into.
What Zander said is incredibly important. If you have an idea for a 240-page epic comic book with this deep amount of world building, if you look at most of some classic fantasy epic stories like The Hobbit or any of the Games of Thrones dictionaries, it's made out of little tiny scenes of chapters that are hopefully entertaining just on their own. And if you take your story, you can tell a 4-page story or a 6-page story set in that world that's interesting. The bigger story is going to be made out of lots of sets of 2, 4, 6, 10-page stories that then tie together to form the bigger epic. And you'll learn more from completing a 4-page comic book story than from not finishing a 60-page comic book story.
I mean, think about Conan the Barbarian was written as a whole bunch of tiny little stories. They're skipping all over his life, and they're all self-contained. And I think that's the best. I think that's the best way to start out for sure.
Thank you. And one more
One more
comment.
thing in. I want to mention the fact that you are in a very, very special part of the country where there's a few places where there's comics communities and creator communities that are tightly knit together, where people are very open, they tend to know each other. The people who are just starting out tend to trade skills, help each other and stuff like that. So there's like Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Western Michigan. There's a few places like this in the country. And if you go to some other places where there are creatives, but there's not as much a creative community like Memphis, Chicago, anywhere else in the Midwest pretty much, these people are struggling to get anything done. And the amount of support you can get here from other creators is insane.
Yay, us.
Yes, thank you.